As Mike had just mentioned, we're covering Nehemiah 2, and in the last sermon I did, I was working on Nehemiah 1. And as I said, we'll do a little bit of a series, kind of a mini-series, working our way through Nehemiah. And today, as we go into chapter 2, we're going to start off by looking at a brief review, since it's been a little while since we talked about Nehemiah 1. And then we're going to peel open a fast-paced text in the beginning of chapter 2, which has a lot packed into it. Now, frequently, people will look at Nehemiah, the whole book, and just draw out leadership lessons, and that's fine. And there are many in there. However, there are plenty of things that we can look at for our prayer life as well, especially in chapters 1 and 2. So this is a story, if we look to the very end of what we're going to talk about today, of answered prayer. So we're going to be looking at Nehemiah's prayer life and how it preceded immediate answered prayers, which display the power and mercy of God. And if you recall, Persia was the ruling empire, and formerly King Cyrus decided that some of the Jews may return to their homeland. Further, you might recall that in the book of Ezra, as well as in events before Ezra, they're closely tied and knit within the book of Nehemiah. And so when we're introduced to Nehemiah in chapter 1, he has just received horrible news from Hanani that the walls of Jerusalem are completely torn up. The gates have been destroyed as well. So let's turn to our text, going back to Nehemiah chapter 1 just for a moment. And we'll go in verses 1 through, I think it's going to be 4. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Kislev in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who has survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. So the situation in Jerusalem was fairly dire. Imagine Jerusalem, no walls, no gates, no protection, only a remnant of the people surviving. Nehemiah knows that the king, King Artaxerxes, had issued the original decree to seek work on the walls back in Ezra 17. And he, Nehemiah, was working for the very same king. Big problem. Because as a slave to the king, he had no power to affect or do much of anything. No influence, the ability to take a rescuing group of people to go fix the situation was pretty remote, if not impossible. And at the same time, he was also very sympathetic to the needs of the people. He was emotionally affected, and if you recall, he started praying right away. It's one of the first things he did. Now, he also prayed for somewhere between 4 to 5 months. So before we go any farther, we know that Nehemiah was earnestly seeking the Lord and what to do. So there's several issues we should call attention to in the transition between chapter 1 and 2, where we're going to be today. Leaving chapter 1, we know a couple of things about Nehemiah. We know he's the cupbearer to the king, and we know that he's included in daily affairs of the king. We know that Nehemiah is a normal component in the palace. He's one of the trusted associates of the king. He's knowledgeable of the etiquette rules of the palace, because if you weren't knowledgeable of them, that could be quite dangerous to your daily routine, in fact, your life. And he knew that he was in an impossible situation, and his first response was prayer. So there are times when the worldliness of today surrounds us and takes a toll on us. Now consider the popular characters we have today. We have sports figures, politicians, business magnates, and the like, and they're gifted with things that we're never going to be able to accomplish it. Think about it. I'm not as fast as the sprinter Usain Bolt. I'm never going to be, especially with my Achilles tendon the way it is. I'm not an heir to my current knowledge, unless my parents tell me so, that of any vast family fortune that has yet been uncovered. So in short, I can't be like somebody else, and nor should I try to be. So while we can often be tempted to follow along and emulate some other character of today, we're prevented from doing so. However, get this, we can look at Nehemiah and we can emulate or be like Nehemiah. In fact, the whole book is for, guess who? Us. So with that in mind, let's look at Nehemiah's lifestyle. To some extent, we gather that as a slave to the king, he probably got to live and work in fairly lush accommodations. He was able to attend the most favorable events. He sampled the finest wines and cuisine, probably, and his job was secure unless he breached etiquette somehow, got the king mad, or was poisoned as a cupbearer. On the one hand, seeming like the thought about him getting poisoned seemed fairly remote because, those people who wanted to get rid of the king knew he had a cupbearer most likely, and so unless, what would be the point of trying to poison him? You'd get Nehemiah instead. So unless you had an issue with or a beef with Nehemiah, why would you go to the effort? Nevertheless, we do read and know that poisoning was common problems in those days. So in chapter 1, we looked at Nehemiah's relationship in prayer, and similarly, last week, Pastor Gordon covered communication attributes. Do you remember that? There were some communication attributes he spoke of in his sermon. And he also explained how these work their way into our relationships today. Likewise, prayer is a relationship too. And as we walk through the text in chapter 1, we know that Nehemiah's normal routine was to build his relationship with God through prayer at all times. Looking at this should make us pause and start thinking about us as to how we can copy Nehemiah's actions. So let's go back and look at Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 4 through 11. It said, "As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. They are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name. And give success to your servant, when? Today. And grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Now I was cupbearer to the king." So this is an instructional model for prayer. And as we mentioned in the last sermon, the shape of the prayer displays a covenantal God on high and admits and pleads for the failures of the people. And Nehemiah commits to prayer and fasting day and night. However, when you look at Nehemiah's prayer, you can see things that he was praying about. If you think about spending today an hour in prayer in the morning and an hour in prayer at night, probably difficult to achieve. I know, I can't get that done. There are times when you do, but you forget about things sometimes right after you get done in your prayer time. So what would you pray about in those times? Well, for Nehemiah, let's turn back for a second to Deuteronomy 7:9. Deuteronomy 7:9 through 12. Listen to the words. "Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations, and repays to their face those who hate him by destroying them. He will not be slack with one who hates him. He will repay him to his face. You shall therefore be careful to do the commandment and the statutes and the rules that I command you today. And because you listen to these rules and keep and do them, the Lord your God will keep with you the covenant and the steadfast love that he swore to your fathers. He will love you, bless you, and multiply you. You hear some similar language there? Let's look at Deuteronomy 4:25. It says, when you father children and children's children and have grown old in the land, if you act corruptly by making a carved image in the form of anything and by doing what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God so as to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that you will soon utterly perish from the land you are going over the Jordan to possess. Jump down to verse 31. For the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not leave you or destroy you or forget the covenant with your fathers that he swore to them. So do you hear some similarities? Do you hear some similarities in the text and what Nehemiah knew when he sat down and he first prayed, and he's pulling these words? When you have time in this coming week, take a look at Deuteronomy 30. It certainly looks like Nehemiah went to the Word for his prayer time. So we can follow this example today. We can look to the Word for our prayer time. If we don't know what to pray about, look in the text. It's here for us. His prayers were executed immediately. It contained the shape and the tenor of the humbleness that were part of Nehemiah and had become part of his daily life. And you know what we know from that? Is Nehemiah had a relationship, a prayer relationship with God. Relationships, though, take effort. They take constant nurturing and attention, and you have to be alert to that. And sometimes, long times of discussion should just be turned into long times of just listening, because that's part of the relationship as well. Now, Nehemiah is praying back to God, who is his promise keeper. He knows the text, and he knows that God is the only one powerful and way beyond what anything Nehemiah could do or what the king could do. In chapter 2 is where we encounter the rapid pace account of Nehemiah's savvy encounter with the king. Now, based on the text and some secular sources, we know that it's not a good idea to be distraught in the presence of the king. Appearances matter, because the king wants everybody happy, because if you're not happy or you look sad or you're disgruntled for some reason, that might make somebody else think that he's not running a good kingdom. Okay? He's not a great ruler. However, as we go into chapter 2, there are some things we're not certain of in this segment. We're not given any clues as to whether the encounter we're about to read is in private or in public. We don't know. And that particular circumstance can cause your opinion to vary as to how the text actually unfolded. And there's also commentators who suspect that the queen may not have been the actual queen and might have actually been someone from the king's harem and not actually the queen. Opinions vary on that, but that also indicates whether or not she had, or how she had direct influence, if she did, on the situation. So let's go to Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What are you requesting?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." Pretty amazing, right? He wants to go back and rebuild the walls that Nehemiah had told him to stop building in the beginning. So, and the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy." And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of God was upon me. So I'm going to challenge you. Why now? Why now? 4 to 5 months. It's impossible, I think, to read through chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2 and not wonder how the king knew that Nehemiah was sad on this day. After all, 4 to 5 months has passed since Nehemiah learned about the walls, and his interaction with the king was constant. I mean, he had to eat, he had to drink, and one could reasonably ask, why didn't this happen sooner? Or what prompted this event? And some think that Nehemiah, or the king finally told Nehemiah he looked sad, maybe because of his physical appearance. How do you think you would look after fasting and praying for months? He might have looked ill, so perhaps out of just genuine concern, he thought, "Is my cupbearer going to fall over here because he looks awful?" Okay? Now, Derek Kidner speculated that Nehemiah, accustomed to being in the king's palace, was frequently intuitive and saw the right moment to purposely express sadness, or in other words, he was doing this on purpose to try and gain something back from the king, and that provoked a comment for the king, because he couldn't just walk up from etiquette and say, "Hey, I want this to happen." Or perhaps, as Derek Thomas speculated, the queen's presence somehow provided him protection. Maybe he had a relationship of good standing with the queen. Regardless of the actual reason for how this unfolded on this inquiry, we know that Nehemiah makes his requests directly, and then he prays at the same time. So look at verse 4. It says, "The king said to me, 'What are you requesting?' So I prayed to the God of heaven." Why? Why do you think he did that? Because Nehemiah had the relationship in order. He had a relationship to place his trust in God for covering, not the king. And recall that Nehemiah's prayer life was regular and constant. It was his normal routine to have a relationship with the Lord. And likely, Nehemiah's time was substantial. Long time in the morning, long time in the evening, fasting, and so forth. Yet, when Artaxerxes, in effect, says, "Tell me now," Nehemiah first prays to God again before making his requests. Now, I could not find any reference to be specific regarding the pace and the meter of this verbal discussion, although I personally believe it was rather quick, kind of like reading a movie script at a key point in time and looking and seeing what's going to happen within a few sentences, because that can change what occurs. And that's important because right as he is questioned by Artaxerxes, he turns to God first as the sovereign controller. I doubt he said, "Please hang on, I have to go to my prayer closet and I'm going to come back to the king." That just wouldn't fit. So it likely was more of a hip shot prayer, something quick, maybe not verbal, maybe in his own mind and under his breath. So over the past few months, Nehemiah prayed regularly, fasted, and as evidenced by chapter 1, he prayed back the scripture as part of his daily routine. Now, one could easily imagine that lengthy prayer time as being a habit for him, and we should be able to follow that as well. The thing is that what we see here is long prayers, spending time morning and evening and fasting, and Nehemiah also has the hip shot prayer. What do we know from that? Prayers don't need to be long. Prayers don't need to be short. Okay? They're both effective. It's the relationship that is built and matters. Here's what's also obvious. Nehemiah had a vision of some type to rebuild. Remember, this conversation may have only lasted a minute or so. If you read quick, you can get through this in 60 seconds or more. Yet, he has the peace and the clarity of mind to interject solid plans right away. Let's look at verse 2:5. Verse 2:5. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. Okay, that's clear. Here's what I want to do. He's obviously sad. He's been praying about this for 4 to 5 months. The opportunity arises, and he comes up with the first request and his objective. The objective is to have the king send him to Judah. And somewhere in his prayer life, have you noticed, somewhere in his prayer life, Nehemiah becomes the actual participant in the rebuilding. Okay, so it goes from praying about this situation a long ways away, and now he becomes the active participant in this particular story. Incredibly, this is the king that stopped that construction, remembering, and proposing to rebuild the city could be thought of as a means of political control. And that would certainly be bad for Nehemiah. I mean, just this first one. I want to go do this, I want to rebuild walls, and perhaps, the king could be thinking, this guy's going to stand against me at some point in time. Let's go to verse 2:6. And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone? And when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. In case you don't know, Nehemiah must have known himself how long it was going to take to get back and forth. Some people estimate it's 800 miles. Okay, that's a long way in your car today. Okay, without doubt, it was going to take him months to get there. And Nehemiah did not have a 401k or a paid vacation package, to my knowledge. So he's deftly requesting that the king send him, and then he was able to gain his approval for an extended absence. Perhaps he told him he was going to come back and check on things or update things a year or months afterwards. We don't know. Let's go to verse 2, 7, and 8. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me, to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. Now, everybody knows how expensive timber or lumber is today. In the last year, it's gone up quite a bit. Lumber, timber, resources back in those days was a very precious commodity. So not only is Nehemiah asking for his time off, he's asking for travel protection, he's asking for supplies to build a wall of something that could be thought of as being against the king, and a house. And for the house that I shall occupy. You see, here's Nehemiah as a slave, wants to head to Jerusalem and build a home, and it's as if he's saying, you know what? I'm going to be the governor there too. That's quite a big statement to ask. Those three things in a row, right off the top of his head. But, you know what? This story, although it seems like it's about Nehemiah and can be looked at from a leadership standpoint in all of its ways of having your plans set before you, I don't think this is about Nehemiah. Why? Let's take a look at the next verse. We know the rest of the story here. And the king granted me what I asked, for the what hand? The good hand of my God was upon me. Now, you see, John MacArthur had said that God works through his servants for his good will. So the story of Nehemiah is a story of the sovereign hand of God as we're walking through this. And I encourage you not to skip over this and say, wow, that's great. You need to look at this and hear it for today. Nehemiah, slave in the king's court, unable to do much of anything, demonstrates a prayer life and a relationship that we can copy today. You may not know what to say in your long prayer times that you have. Go back to your text. Build the relationship, and your hip shot prayers will become more fluid and automatic because you have God in the right position. How many times do we spend our quiet time either going through the motions or just praying, or you set aside 30 minutes and you get through 3 and the dog barks or something else happens and you're pulled away. And then you forget about things for the rest of the day. But when we don't know what to pray, pray through the text and then pray from our text. Nehemiah's devotion and relationship building was the plan of God. Okay? He knew that the king granted his request because the hand of God was upon him. He took no credit for himself. He didn't say, I did these things and this happened. He said, I did these things and God had favor on me. When the right time came, Nehemiah was really, when you look at this from a strong and confidence-building standpoint, Nehemiah shows spiritual battlefield courage. How can you not see this as a battlefield? He's walking into the palace. The king's already, everything he's doing is against what the king had originally set in place. We also see that his godliness is remarkable. In both relaxed prayer, day and night, and fasting, and in urgent situations, as I mentioned in the first sermon, God comes first for him. It comes first for him in his prayer life on a daily basis, and it came first to him in an emergency. He interrupts and says, so I prayed to God. So this shows us that the relationship and the knowledge that Nehemiah had was on the vertical communication, and Pastor Gordon alluded to that last week as well. Some theologians think that Nehemiah was a particularly wise or perhaps even a cunning individual. Being a cupbearer to the king did include a great deal of confidence from the king, and yet some people suggest that Nehemiah sensed the right time to make his request and did so cleverly. Now, they're not suggesting that Nehemiah was acting without any control from God or providence in there, but they're just saying that perhaps this was a clever motive. Now, have you looked at the text again and said, have you noticed that the word Jerusalem is not mentioned? It refers to the city of Nehemiah's fathers. Now, that might have been for a couple of reasons. It might have been to tug at the heartstrings of the king because the optics of the situation, I don't think they said optics in those days, but we do now. So the optics of the situation would have looked like Nehemiah's got pain on his heart because of his family. Now, the king, being familiar with how things looked and keeping up appearances, might have had some pity for that. We don't know. We really don't know. It could also have been that Nehemiah was spinning the conversation to make it look at an issue of self-esteem, that Nehemiah couldn't act properly in the king's court, keep up appearances, because this whole thing was burdening him down. Either way, Nehemiah is going against the king. But we do know one thing for certain. He gave credit to the glory of the good hand of God. You see, there's 4 things here from Nehemiah. 4 things. Nehemiah desired a relationship with God. Can any of you see otherwise? 4 months, perhaps 5 months, praying, day, night, fasting. Nehemiah knew God was listening. If you go back and you look at the text, and he uses the words, remember the promises, okay? He knew God was listening and aware of what he needed. Nehemiah was bold, spiritual battlefield time, right now. And he was afraid, but he didn't cower in front of the king. He turns to God. He has his priorities correct. And he asked at precisely the right time. I have no doubt that that's because the good hand of God was upon him. So what do we know from this? First of all, we have to pray patiently. I admit, somewhat sheepishly, and I'm quite certain in a room this size, there are other people who will say the same if you're honest, that you confess that when you pray, you want God to act when? Now, right? I want God to act today. I want this fixed. I don't want to deal with this. Not tomorrow, not next month. So why did Nehemiah pray for over 4 months? Why do you think? It could be, and I think there's heavy merit to this, to demonstrate that patience and perseverance and confidence in the promises of God can be relied on in the Bible for us. Perhaps looking back to Deuteronomy, Nehemiah prayed what he knew was true about the Lord, and you know what? We should too. We should also pray right now. Nehemiah, you've heard the phrase, lead by example. Nehemiah was, in essence, reading by example, as I see it. As Christians, if we have a sincere and interactive prayer life, that builds our faith and our relationship with Christ. We learn to pray whenever, silently or outspoken, dedicated times like communion, which we'll have today, which build our faith from the inside out. We have established that relationship and are working into it in our sanctification. And we also need to tell others about the good hand of God. How many people do you think know that the good hand of God was on Nehemiah from this book? Okay? Everybody who picks it up and reads it. Profess your faith in prayer because the good hand of God is always upon you. The goodness and mercy are often demonstrated in remarkable ways that we don't understand, some that we can look back on and say we do get it. But we should always joyously tell others about how we are led, just as Nehemiah has done for us.